like to welcome everyone, distinguished guests and members of the linguistics community of Hudson University. We are glad to see all of you here today. We have the privilege of welcoming Professor Ted Gibson, who is a professor of cognitive sciences and the principal investigator at TED Lab, the language laboratory at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He studies various topics such as information processing and cross-linguistic universals, the relationship between culture and cognition, including language and language processing. He's also worked with indigenous people in the Amazon region. That is why if you're from Hudson, you might recognize him from the documentary Grammar of Happiness, which we all watched for one of our lectures. We know that his contributions to understanding of language have not only shaped academic discourse, but have had practical implications for the people working in the various fields of linguistics. And we think this speech is going to be very important in that it highlights one of the more overshadowed approaches to syntax. As students of linguistics and even syntacticians, if you are one, we usually study or learn about the predominant paradigm, phrase structure grammar, in our syntax classes. But we think this talk will draw more attention to a different approach to syntax called dependency grammar. So today's presentation will not just be academic discourse, but it will be a journey into the mechanics of the tool that binds us together as people. For this reason, we think there is no one more credible than him to talk about this topic. Before I hand it over, I'd like to remind everyone that due to Turkish personal data protection law, this entire meeting will be recorded, and by accessing this virtual meeting, you consent to being recorded. Now I will hand over to Professor Gibson for his talk titled Cognitive Approach to Syntax, Dependency Grammar. Professor, you may.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. I guess I'm going to share just one second. There we go. Okay, good. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. Yeah, this presentation is actually a summary of a book that I have just written, which will be published soon by MIT Press. And the book is called Syntax: A Cognitive Approach. The project of writing this book started when my collaborator and wife, Ev Fedorenko, asked me to write a summary of what syntax is for her researchers who usually have a computational or neuroscience background, but they don't usually have linguistics background. So I've been teaching syntax for a really long time, actually, for over 30 years. But I never wrote such a paper or a book. And I realized as I started to try to do this, that my approach is really quite different from what's currently available in the syntax market. So I began to write this actually about 1.5 years ago. And I had a first draft about a year ago. And I gave it to a lot of people for comments. And it's a little, actually, I got to thank these people, but I was going to thank all these people and tell you who's been reading this. And it's a kind of an introduction to syntax. So I don't really know if it's the right thing for your guys' talk, but it's been what I've been working on for what you want to hear about. It's meant to sort of introduce syntax to people who don't normally work on language. And I find that the way that syntax is typically introduced isn't very compelling. I don't find it very compelling. And there are really compelling ways to introduce it. And so that's what I'm trying to do here. So as I finished a draft about 1 year ago, and many people have helped me with this, including Ev Fedorenko, Steve Piantadosi, a bunch of ex-students, Richard Futrell, Kyle Malwald, Corey Shane is a current postdoc, actually, and Michael Hahn and Yanis Dacuna, and the current students here, Moshe Poliak, Thomas Clark, and Sohan Chen, and Eric Martinez helped a lot. And then I sent it to a lot of other people. And Dick Hudson was amazing. He's a dependency grammar person. He read so many different versions of this. He was so helpful. And Ray Jagendoff read a lot. I don't think he likes it, but what do you do? You know, not everyone can like everything. Martin Haspelmath does, and so does Jack Hawkins and a bunch of other people, Ruth Chavez. These people are very, very amazing. Like, our community is actually, many communities are very, very helpful, actually, about reading and commenting. And so I've rewritten so much. I've learned so much in this process, actually. I think most of these people like what I'm doing here. It's an intro thing, and so most people won't disagree with most of it. I thought it was going to be 50 pages or 30 pages. It turned into 250 pages. It's long. But it's not really a textbook. It doesn't really have exercises. It's meant for sort of smart, curious people. It's going to be free and freely available. It's open access when it comes out. So anyone can have it for free. I mean, you can buy a hard copy if you want, but it's going to be like open access is the way of the future here. So let's get into it. There are, as Dilar sort of mentioned there are two kinds of dominant frameworks in depending on where you are, kind of ways of thinking about language. Probably the most dominant is phrase structure grammar. And dependency grammar has been around just for as long, a little bit longer actually, but is depending on what your community is sort of less dominant. In linguistics, I think phrase structure grammar is more common. In computational linguistics, maybe dependency grammar is more common. So phrase structure grammar really invented by Chomsky in the 50s, elaborated by him and his colleagues over the decades since. Dependency grammar is invented by this guy Tesniere back in the 30s. Really, he only only came available in the 50s. His writing became available and independently discovered by Melcuk in the Czech Republic, and also very late writing up his work. And Dick Hudson is a British version of the dependency grammar, so-called word grammar. So these are kind of the compositional base for the grammar is dependency grammar or phrase structure grammar and everyone's grammar. Then there's these, how do you deal with long distance dependencies? There's sort of two ways to do that. The displacement phenomena, such as, things like passive and auxiliary movement in English and filler gap dependencies. How do you do those? And Chomsky's famous for proposing movement of constituents. But the other approach here is a so-called lexical rule approach, where you have a rule such that, there's just two versions of a word like will. An auxiliary verb like will, there's a declarative, and from the declarative, you can create an interrogative, which has slightly different argument structure, so that it comes first as opposed to second. So it's just a lexical rule, as opposed to a movement. There's no movement. There's two wills. Okay, so anyway, I'll get into that later. There's ways to think about grammar. The reason I like dependency grammar is it's very simple. It's really simple, minimal structure, and there's no movement in phrase structure either. But I just like I like having no movement or empty elements. That is simplicity here. The main reason why I like dependency grammar, though, is that it transparently explains cognitive complexity phenomena, such that longer distance connections are harder to produce and comprehend. I'd say that's just a fact. Across all languages, long distance connections are harder to produce and comprehend. And I'll give you a bunch of evidence for that. And dependency grammar makes that transparent. Like, you just see that in the structures. It doesn't mean that that's the right structure, but it makes it useful to think about as a way to think about language. And that gives you a way to think about why. This is why I think why it's a great formalism and why it's kind of exciting to teach, is it explains why some word orders exist and some don't, or some are very common and some are very uncommon because of cognitive complexity phenomena. You get these so-called harmonic such that, harmonic phenomena such that if a language is head initial in one category, it tends to be head initial in another category. If it's verb initial, then it tends to be prepositions as opposed to be postpositions. If it's verb initial, it tends to be complementizer first as opposed to complementizer, subordinator first, complementizer first as opposed to subordinator final. And those things just straightforwardly follow from dependency length minimization, from cognitive complexity. And so that's why that's like a way to think about why grammar is the way it is across languages in a simple way. So that's why I like it. This is not an argument against phrase structure grammar per se, because phrase structure grammar also has headedness in it, in almost all versions of phrase structure. It's a little less transparent. It's just harder to see on the structures. So you can't really, like in the dependency grammars, you can just see where the heads and dependents are. That's what those representations are. In the phrase structure grammar, that's just a little harder to see. And so it makes it harder to make inferences as experimentalists, as theoreticians about what's going on. I'll get into that more. It's like there's a phrase structure of kind of a simple sentence with a lot of modifiers in English. Anna slept in the hall on Tuesday at 9 for 3 hours. This is an X bar phrase structure with a lot of adjunction, according to, you know, the way this, there's different frameworks, different ways of do phrase structure. This is one way to do it in the sort of 80s, maybe 90s, you know, 20 to 30 years ago, maybe 70s as well, for a long time. So it's a little, I mean, there's a lot of structure here. There's no movement in this structure. I'm not going to go through this. I'm just going to say, you know, there's a lot of nodes. These VP nodes are kind of adjunction nodes, which are used in that formalism for some kind of measure of simplicity. In dependency grammar, what I like about it is if you've got n words, the syntax is just n-1 connections among the words to form the structure for the utterance, which is a tree, or you know, a directed acyclic graph is a tree. Those things are the same graph theoretically. It's very much of a what you see is what you get formalism. So if I have a simple sentence like the girl sleeps, there's a head of that whole thing. We have to figure out what the heads and dependents are. I can give you rules. They're the same kinds of rules, the same kinds of ideas in all the formalisms are out there. So girl depends on sleeps, the depends on girl. I'm going to draw arrows from the head to the dependents, and there's always one root. I don't have to draw the root. There's always one thing that is the head of a whole sentence, and you know, all sentences have one head associated with it because they are directed acyclic graphs. This just makes it easier to see what it is. I don't have to draw it. But it just makes it easier to see. So if and you know, another sentence like Vanessa chased a squirrel looks like that. I mean, there's some choices here about, you know, whether the is the head or girl is ahead of this combination here. There's arguments you can be made for one or the other. That doesn't really matter for the formalism I'm talking about here. I mean, I happen to draw the nouns as the head of these phrases, of these pairs, but it could be the other way and it wouldn't affect what I'm saying here. Here's a more complicated sentence. The girl thought that Vanessa chased a squirrel. I mean, all the point is I'm making here is a very kind of a simple representation of a kind of a long sentence. There's just one link for every word. For all the words in a sentence, there's just one link to link each word somewhere in that sentence. Okay, and so that sentence that I had before, which was phrase structure, here it is in dependency grammar. So it's just a bunch of dependents here on slept, right? So Anna slept, you know, in the hall on Tuesday at 9 o'clock for 3 hours. Okay, so I mean, maybe it's, you know, it's a very simple formalism, but that doesn't mean it's right. And the point is that the thing I like about it transparently explains cognitive phenomena. Now I'm going to tell you and explains why word orders exist and don't. Another reason I like it is in the advent of large language models. It turns out that large language models represent dependencies very directly. So Chris Manning, in a recent paper, well, it's actually not that recent, it's 4 years old, showed that in BERT, for example, this is one of these large language models, represents dependencies very directly. They figured out some way to implicitly figure out what the syntactic structure was inside in this large language model for a bunch of sentences, for a whole lot of sentences. And, you know, there are two different structures here. One's in blue and one's in black. There's the black one is the human annotated one, and the blue one is the one they inferred from BERT using this technology called structural probe. It's kind of complicated, but it's basically trying to figure out which words depend on which words to get the meanings that it's inferring, that it's got for these sentences. And what you'll notice is these representations are identical. There's no differences. In most of the dependency structures that they looked at, there were like zero differences in what people thought was the right tree and what BERT thinks is the right tree. So, and BERT's not being trained on this at all. BERT's being just trained to predict the next word. That's all it's doing, and somehow it's inferring these dependency structures. So maybe part of the success of large language models is their ability to learn dependency structures well. So my guess is that maybe large language models are learning something like a dependency grammar, a usage-based dependency grammar, which is what I think that's what I think is probably the best sort of grammatical theory at the moment. Dependency grammar based with very much usage-based, which whatever people say and do, and that's construction grammar-y. I get people are familiar with that. And I should say there's no such success with phrase structure. They can't find the phrase structure. It's hard, it's not easy to find those relationships in the large language models. Doesn't mean they're not there. You know, just because you didn't find them doesn't mean they're not there. It just, this is kind of an argument for dependency grammar here, simplicity. It doesn't mean not phrase structure. Okay, so what I want to do today in the time I have, and I got like, I don't know, about 40 more minutes or something like that, I was going to talk. I was going to give you these 3 sections and probably a couple more after that, but these 3 at least, which are, I was going to tell you about why I like, the reason I like dependency grammar is that it represents dependency lengths transparently. I mean, it represents dependency locality very directly, dependency length minimization very directly. And then I'll tell you about some of the word order constraints across languages, these just a couple of these harmonic things which follow from dependency length minimization. So this is the kind of all the arguments for these things I want to tell you just roughly about why I like dependency grammar, why it's simple and sort of not a standard. These aren't sort of standard things taught in a syntax textbook, but I think they should be. I think these are like, this is like that's why I think it's a syntax, a cognitive approach is the label that I call this book, is it's all about dependency length minimization as evidence like that. That's something that seems to be true across all languages, and it drives word order. That's really interesting. And then I was going to tell you like one of the arguments why I don't like movement. Okay. And that's the movement idea is from Chomsky. It's a really clever idea, frankly, from Chomsky 57. The movement proposal was from Chomsky 57. And then he observed back in 1971 that it was hard to learn, that movement is something that is difficult to learn. And you know, he made the strong claim that because it's hard to learn, it must be innate. You know, that's a pretty, you know, ballsy move, frankly. It's like, here's something I can't learn, therefore it's innate. How about it's not part of the grammar? The alternative is just not part of the grammar. Maybe there isn't movement, you know, and I think that's the alternative that makes more sense, is that lexical rules are learnable and they're not movement. They don't have this problem. And, you know, clearly large language models are learning English kind of perfectly. So the learnability problem from the input is wrong. You know, I mean, he'll say, you know, that the large language models have access to more data than children have, but I think it's, you know, you know, there's always arguments to be had here, but I think it's, you know, a different approach is maybe the lexical rules is the way to go here. But I'll just go through that argument. And then after that, I think I'll say a couple of other things and we'll see how that goes, how the time is. Okay. So first, let's talk about the dependency length transparently being represented. Okay. Okay, so the first evidence for that is just the existence of the fact that center embedded structures are universally hard to produce and comprehend. And dependency grammar represents that very transparently, that they're hard because there's always long distance connections in those. So here's English, some English examples. I'm going to give you some Japanese examples as well. I don't have Turkish examples, but they would be similar. So it's true in every language that if you center, so in English, I've got here, the boy who the dog bit was upset. Here's the dependency grammar representation of that, where I've got, you know, the connecting to boy, boy is connecting to was, and was to upset. I mean, whatever the labels of these categories are, it doesn't really matter. And then there's some clause here, who the dog bit, which is connecting to boy as well. So boy is to who, and who is to bit, dog to bit as well. Okay, and you'll notice that there's some longish dependencies there, boy and was, and bit back to who. And but it gets a lot worse in B. Okay, so if I want to say the boy who the dog, oh, I'm going to do that again here, who the dog which the cat chased bit was upset. That's really hard to understand. That's really hard to produce, really hard to understand. And lo and behold, these are really long distance dependencies. Maybe that's what's hard about this, is the long distance dependencies. There's some cost maybe associated with producing and or comprehending these long distance connections. It's like, I don't get to say too much here. So it's the same boy who was upset, but now I've got more stuff in between here. The dog which the cat chased bit. So the boy who bit there, there's like two very long distance ones here, one very long distance one there. Maybe that's what's driving the difficulty of these things. And it's true in all languages that this kind of structure is very difficult to produce and comprehend. And correspond, you can say something with a similar meaning, which as long as the dependencies are local, there's no trouble in doing that. The cat chased the dog, which bit the boy, who was upset. The dependencies are all local, no problem producing and comprehending that. And it's not just SVO word order like English. You can do SOV word order like Japanese, or lots of languages have SOV word order, and different things get embedded. So here's the babysitter said that my older brother bullied my younger sister in Japanese. And so that's babysitter said brother bullied sister. And there's two different ways I could have said this. I could have put babysitter right beside said, and that would have been an easier way to say this actually in Japanese, rather than putting babysitter right at the beginning here. I could put I could put it right against said, and that would be even easier. The dependencies would be more local. But this is for the purposes of embedding again. I can put something inside that again. Technically I should be able to do that, and it ends up with something which is really hard to produce and comprehend in Japanese. So this is the aunt thinks that the babysitter said that the brother bullied the sister, and that's really hard to understand and produce. Again, very long distance connections. Maybe that's what's driving the difficulty of producing and comprehending the long distance connections. And that's the generalization across all languages. Center embedding, when you have long distance connections like that, people just have a really hard time producing and comprehending them. Just can't do it. Doesn't matter what. There's no exceptions to that. I mean, the details are interesting. Like the details of what exactly makes that hard or easy are still need to be worked out to some degree. We're working on that. But certainly the case that the longer the distances are, the worse these things are to produce and comprehend. So a long time ago now, it's almost 20 years, Dan Grutter and I did a bunch of experiments in English, and we investigated the relationship between reading times and dependency distance, and we looked across a bunch of structures. And we looked at, so here's a sentence like, I don't know what number this is. The administrator who the nurse who is from the clinic supervised scolded the medic. I guess that's this very last one, that's F. And most of the connections are kind of local, but the supervised and scolded connections are really long. The administrator who the nurse who was from the clinic supervised, oh my God, that's the nurse supervised who here, that's really hard, and scolded someone. And so the prediction is of the dependency length idea is that when you have to make long distance connections, so that's at supervised and at scolded. So I don't have to, I can't make them early on because I don't know those things are coming until I get the second half of that dependency. I need the second half of the dependency to know where I'm connecting it to. When I get those, that's the longer that is, the harder the harder it's going to be. So the slower the reading times in this dependent measure. So most of the connections here are actually still very local, but those two are not. And what we see in reading times is some of these reading times up here are associated with those. Just like these are just all the sort of phrases and words in those sentences. There's a lot of local ones people read fast, but when you get really long ones, people read much more slowly. So and when there are very complicated sentences like that, this is just, I'd say, true. It's less true for shorter sentences. And so I'll say, I don't know how much more I'll say about that. So this is, in particular kinds of materials, this is definitely true, long distance materials. Why is it true is a good question. I'm saying it's about dependency length. It's something about dependency length. Is it really about the integration? I'm not sure. And in fact, I can say more about that later. Anyway, we see it not only in unambiguous structure, we see it in choices and ambiguity. Here are some, I think, sort of entertaining English examples of cases where there's people you can I don't know if you've seen me talk about these examples before. So the Toronto law to protect squirrels hit by mare is a headline, which I found funny. I'm from Toronto, I'm from Canada. And when I was growing up, that was there. And the reason it's funny is it was intended that the law was attacked, criticized, hit by the mayor, but people can't help but notice when they read this often that the law is there to protect the squirrels who were hit by the mayor. It's an ambiguous sentence, and because there's a local thing, which is weird, if it's local, you can't help but compute it as the idea. And it's then that makes this a little bit funny. And that's the same with this translation here. This is in a Russian hotel in St. Petersburg, I think. It said you can visit the cemetery where famous Russian composers are buried daily except Thursday. In English, that's not the way to word this, because that sounds like what was intended was the cemetery. You can visit that cemetery on daily except Thursday, but the way this was worded was that they're buried there daily except Thursday. You can't help but notice that. That's just too local, and people universally think that's weird. So and there's lots of more evidence for locality is just like something people can't help but do in ambiguity. So another measure is in fMRI. So rather than one of those measures was like, so one sort of overall complexity in production and comprehension. Another was there's reading times, and this third one is in fMRI activation. So this is work by Corey Shane very recently, well, last 2 years ago now in 2022, in Journal Neuroscience. And he got a data set in which 78 people, a large population of people here, were listening to 10. They didn't all listen to all 10 of these naturalistic stories. I think they listened to some subset of those 10 naturalistic stories, which are kind of, they're about 500 words each. They're spoken by one of two speakers. And these aren't totally natural stories. They're stories with kind of slightly complicated materials, long distance dependencies in there, and low frequency stuff, low frequency words, in order to investigate psycholinguistic phenomena in a more comprehensive way. And he looked at, this guy Corey Shane looked at many different measures of working memory predictors in the activation while people were listening to these stories. And he also looked, he looked in where in where in the sentences the brain activation sure could occur, and where in the brain these things might occur. And so what he did, this is like stuff, this is out of Ev Fedorenko's lab, and so she always has people do a language localizer first. And so what it turns out that I'm going to say more about this at the end, sort of talking about how syntax fits in language, which fits in the brain. So the brain is organized in all of us, such as a left lateralized network, the so-called language network, which is specialized for language. We're all similar, but we're all different, okay, as humans. And so my left lateralized network is very similar to every one of yours, but it's also very different. And the way it's different is this sort of the same or different as my face is from yours. And so it looks similar to some other species, but you and I can all tell that we all look very different from each other. And so there's a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of differences. And so this is like a left-hand picture of the brain, and there's like a lot of stuff going on the surface of the cortex in the language network for everyone. Every single person will have some activation in each one of these kinds of networks, something up in left frontal, something left parietal. Everyone will have some of this. You won't have as big as this. This is kind of the network where everyone's regions will occur. And there's also some of it's right. It's not all left lateralized. My network happens to be very left lateralized. It doesn't mean anything to be more left, right. So there's some people, various people's have some more right laterals, some more stuff going on the right. Everyone has a very strong left, and some people have some stuff going on the right. And so anyways, we can find that network in 10 minutes in you. So you lie in the scanner and you listen to language, whatever language you speak. If you want to, if you speak Turkish, you listen to Turkish, and then you listen to backwards speech, or you listen to a language you don't understand, or you listen to muffled Turkish, or you read Turkish and you read non-words in Turkish, or you do this in English, and it doesn't matter the language. And we'll find in that 10 minutes, very short time, some network, which turns out, those activations are activating for language minus non-language. Okay, sort of where we're going to not count the perceptual stuff. I'm interested. We're still interested in things like speech, and we're still interested in stuff like reading. But we're not going to call that the language network. Those are other networks that we're going to be interested in. And that's what this is here. This is the average language network is localizing that across. Each person has some activation in those, and then we can look to see in that network what how that network responds to listening to these sentences. This is what Corey Shane did in this particular experiment. And it turns out that network responds robustly to long distance dependencies. So if there's long distance dependencies in there, the activation goes up. And if there's local dependencies, there's not much going on. So that's what this is. So this over here is the language network over here, and over here I guess is the, oh, this is just some other, there's multiple theories here. There was the integration cost, the connections versus holding on to things. The storage cost thing didn't work. Okay, there's nothing that worked out there. But in the integration, there's like a strong activation reliably in the language network, and not in other networks. Okay, so there's something called the multiple demands network, which responds to lots of other cognitively complicated tasks, which we can also localize in you. Say you're doing arithmetic, so you do a spatial task, spatial memory task. That network will respond very strongly. It doesn't respond to language. That one doesn't respond to language integrations either. So anyways, this guy, Corey, is a really amazing, nice experiment showing that the long distance dependencies are reliably getting more activated than more local dependencies, and just normal listening across a lot of people, and as surprisal. So I don't know, but I haven't talked about syntactic surprisal here. That's a very reliable measure of difficulty. So just about, that, and that's completely independent of that. You also, in that, I guess that's also in the language network, you get the surprisal measure as well. I don't have that on this figure here. Okay, so the point of this up to now, it's just a recent, very nice brain measure of dependency distance being a cost. Okay, so that's what I've said. So and the reason I like dependency grammar is it represents those things very directly. The long distance dependencies are you just read them off the structures. Okay, you just read the dependencies, the distances off the structures. They're just like, if I drew a phrase structure of those things, it's just kind of harder to see. It's hard. It's not like it's not there. It's just hard to see. So I'm not saying the phrase structure is wrong. I'm saying this is easier for me to make inferences about. Okay, so then dependency distance offers a nice motivation for word order constraints. Let's move on to that. Okay, so this is a bunch of work. It started with a bunch of work that Richard Futrell Mahawalda and I did a few years ago. Boy, it's a while now, 9 years ago, working on dependency, looking at dependency lengths across languages. We wanted to see whether languages tended to minimize dependency lengths. So we looked at a large database of parsed sentences across, we had 37 languages parsed. I mean, we actually sort of created some of those, but it's mostly in this thing called the Universal Dependencies Corpora. We had to create some of those ourselves, but by now there's up to more than 50 or 60 languages, for which there's a nice corpus which has been parsed in dependency grammar formalism. And so then for every sentence and for every one of those languages, we computed the total dependency distance in terms of words, just for simplicity. And so here's, Mary threw away the important documents that she brought home yesterday. The total distance there is 16. Just 1 + 1 + 4, etc. is 16. That's an English sentence. That's the total dependency distance for that sentence. And then we wanted to compare that dependency distance to some baselines, some baseline controls. And so one thing we did was we just start at the root, start it through in this case, and then we give a random order to that head and all of its dependents that are, Mary, away, and documents. So it's 4 things. We take those things and scramble the order in some random order. And then we do that going all the way down this tree. This is a tree, right? So we go from documents, and there's a bunch of stuff off documents. I guess 1, 2, 3, there's 3 dependents and 1 head there. Do that all the way down the tree, randomly order these things. And then we look at the length of the dependent, the total of the structure that results. So it's just like, this is one of them. Okay, there's a 1 random order. So I just started, I don't know where the hell I started. I guess I started it through, and then I randomly ordered those things, and it happened to be through first. And I guess whatever it is, Mary, away, and documents. That was the order it gave. And then it went down and scrambled all those things in the same way. And we get this, horrendous scrambled non-tree. I mean, it is a tree, actually. It's technically still a tree, but this tree has cross dependencies. So it's still a tree. It's just got a lot of cross dependencies. So when you have this has no cross. Most of human languages don't look like this. They don't have all these cross dependencies. That's so-called projective, when you don't allow cross dependencies. So this is non-projective. And so and you notice that the dependency distance here are horrendous suddenly. If you do random, it turns out really, and that's true in general. That is actually a random one I generated, and they're all like that. They're for a local thing like this, they end up being really, but we can constrain it so it's not not random like that. We can constrain it so it's random but still projective, and we still get kind of long. So this is a projective one, which is still scrambled, not English again, but it's a baseline. And then we can compare the lengths of either fully random to projective random to the things that people actually wrote and said in these corpora. And so we had 37 languages originally from 10 families, I think. And the results are, it's kind of this is 37 languages here. Here's English. They're all kind of similar. What we got here is x-axis is the length of the sentence. It doesn't even say, oh, it does say that down there, sentence length. Okay, so as sentences get longer, and I think it's going up to, over like around 10 words here, 20 words, 30, around 10 and 20 words is where you start to see things pull apart, where the blue is what the lengths of the sentences that are really happening. And the red is the length of those projective, it says free, but it's not actually, that's the projective baseline. The non-projective one is up here. It's really horrible. It goes up steeper than those. I didn't put that on this figure. And you notice that the red, and then there's a third line here, which is if you were able to word your language such that you always chose the most local dependency, then you get this green line. And the thing, languages can't quite do that. There's some pressures here. Like the reason they can't do that is like, languages have word order constraints. And I'm going to try and say why we have we have those word order constraints, presumably because it's easier to learn things if we have consistent word orders. Okay, and so we want to know those consistent word orders, though, will tend to minimize dependency lengths. But if the green line would be if there are no constraints and you just do the local thing always. And then the reason we probably don't have that, we don't know why we don't have that, but no languages does that. We don't do that, is that probably it's probably beneficial in learning to have rules about how things actually, they tend to happen. It's probably easier for a child to learn. Anyway, but the point about this figure is that the red line is above the blue line for every language. Okay, so even that projective baseline is has longer distance dependencies than what people actually say. So all languages are minimizing dependency lengths to some degree. Now you're probably looking at Turkish. If you guys are speaking Turkish and you're thinking, hey, whoa, that's a lot closer to the red line than English is. And, but it is, reliably below. But it is interesting that there's a lot of variability between languages here. And that's, in part due, so I think Chinese is a lot closer. And where's Japanese? Where is that? I didn't even look. I'm sorry. Oh, there it is. Yeah, it's not. Some of these languages are. I mean, Latin's a little silly, and Telugu is just a tiny corpus for this time in which we did this. But so Latin is a little silly in that this is a weird corpus that most of these corpora are kind of newswire or something like that, sort of information passing corpuses. Whereas Latin, it's more like poetry, art, and stuff. Okay, and so when you have poetry, it's the constraints are different. So, Latin is what's sometimes called more of a free word order language. We don't have, of course, Latin's a dead language. There's no native speakers of Latin anymore. But it's so-called free word order, such that you can technically put words almost anywhere. And so if you have some other constraint on how you want to word things, for instance, you want some interesting rhymes. That's what poetry is a lot of times, or rhymes or some kind of phrasing in a certain way, which sounds really good and for phonological reasons, as opposed to meaning reasons. Then you can end up with long distance dependencies and a lot of cross dependencies, in fact. And so it's kind of interesting actually that it's so close, but that's, I think, plausibly because it's a different type of corpus. So most of these are written, some of them are spoken. It's true in all of them. I'm not really sure why like Turkish and Chinese are closer. It's possibly partly due to how the particular grammars are. The particular languages are parsed. So some of them are, the function words, the case markers are parsed separately in some of these languages, just because of who the dependency grammar people are. And some of them, they put them as part of that word. Okay, so like you have case markers on the ends of your words in Turkish. We don't really have them in English. And so if those, you imagine you will get very different results, it turns out. if you put the case markers as words or not, basically. And so that people in these communities, I'm not, we just taking the universal dependencies corpora as it is. And so, that we get these interesting, weird differences, which we probably could maybe try to explain, but we haven't bothered to. Well, I mean, maybe Richard I haven't bothered to understand detail. Okay, so the main point here is just that all languages minimize dependencies to some degree, which is pretty cool. And it seems to be part the grammar's doing that, and I'm going to say something more about that now. The language, the verb object tends to do a preposition, NP, and a complementizer verb order. Okay, it does that. Okay, let's talk. And so that's what's called harmonic word orders, which has been observed way back to Greenberg and Veneman. And Jack Hawkins and Matt Dreyer offered, Matt Hawkins offered an explanation which is very like the dependency lengthenization one. And I'll just say more about that now. So I just want to just observe it to you, just show you how it works. So here's English. It's an SVO language. Here are all the verb initial kind of word orders for different kinds of argument structures. That's a transitive kind of verb, like I don't know, kick or bake. This is a double object. This is some noun. This is like a noun and prepositional phrase object or something. Different kinds of things. And this is a verb which takes a embedded clause, which is marked by a complementizer or subordinator, depending on what you label that thing there. And so these are all verbal things, and these are different. These are other kinds of heads. This is a complementizer or a subordinator, and it takes a verb as its a tensed verb as its argument, and a preposition takes a nouns, and then these are like modifier kinds of cases here. So these are the way that verb initial SVO languages tend to do things. A verb final language will tend to flip most of those. So this is how Japanese and Korean, I think Turkish does all these things this way. Most of these, I'm not sure about Turkish actually. I do know Japanese and Korean do these things this way. So they're all verb final for sure. And they're complementizer final. And they are, so that's just the verb is coming at the end. This is also the complementizer comes after its embedded clause. They're not prepositions, they're postpositions. I'm still calling them, just to be consistent here, I'm calling the same head. But so that's how these things tend to do it. Now, why do they do it? It's plausibly because they minimize dependency length. So this is English. Zoe ate pizza. Zoe gave pizza to Francine. This is Japanese. Zoe pizza ate. Zoe gave pizza to Francine. This is, you probably are off. This is like Turkish, I presume. So Alfred said that Zoe gave pizza to Francine. This is Alfred said here that Zoe gave pizza to Francine. So it's very different word order to say the same thing, but the dependencies are very local in Japanese or Korean. So here's a more complicated sentence in each of these languages. So this is just to lengthen out the embedded clause. We can see how why you might want to keep the order of verbs and their arguments and the subordinator or complementizer and its argument in the same direction. So this is what they do in English. So Alfred said that Zoe gave pizza to monkeys who wanted bananas. Okay, I just added some modifier to monkeys here to make it longer. Okay, and then here's the Japanese version here. Alfred said that Zoe gave pizza to monkeys who wanted bananas, and it all comes at the beginning. It all goes to the other end, and the dependency is everything's local in these cases. Now, what happens if I move this complementizer to the end after gave? Well, it has to come after all of that. It has to come here. Okay, and what happens if I move the complementizer here to the beginning? That means it has to come at the beginning of here. And if it comes, so in either one of those cases, when I put that at the end or that at the beginning in a verb initial or a verb final language, that just creates crazy long dependencies. So the said still goes all the way to the end, and then it comes all the way back to gave. And so that's what this looks like, right? And it's a long dependencies, not good. So that's why language, an argument why dependency length says you shouldn't do that. Don't do that. It's better if I want to say these kinds of things, if I want to say complicated stuff inside my complements, it's inside the arguments of my verbs, then I probably don't want to say that. I don't want to do that. And similarly, if I have verb final, then I kind of don't want to do complementizer initial, probably. And so because you get very long dependencies if you do that. But in cross languages, that's what you see. So this is from the World Atlas of Linguistic Structures. These are harmonic word orders that, I mean, this is just sort of the like without the explanation, this is the observation that languages which are English-like are verb, object, and subordinated initial most of the time, or they're Japanese-like, which are object, verb, and subordinated final. There's like actually quite a large proportion of languages which violate this, and that's probably because there's something really good about having subordinator initial, which people are trying to understand, don't really understand. But overall, there's this giant bias for those two. Similarly, in verb object, so it's, the claim is not that this is the only thing that affects word order, but this is a thing which makes a big difference in how word order. So like the fact that there are these two across the a few hundred languages where we see both of these kinds of categories, we see there's a dominance of harmonic in those two, and same for verb object and prepositions versus object verb and postposition. So there it's much clearer. We have this very dominant bias towards matching as opposed to non-matching. It doesn't mean there aren't exceptions. There are exceptions. What do people do in those exceptions? I mean, I don't know. But the theory, the hypothesis would be that you'd have some other way to say these complicated things, which we don't have to say this kind of sentence. Like I probably can, I can just put this thing about, monkeys who wanted bananas or whatever somewhere else, right? I don't have to put it embedded in this sentence. I'm not going to want to say that. I mean, under this theory, you're going to want to do that some other way, because the theory definitely says long distance dependencies are hard to produce and comprehend. That's the baseline here, that those are hard to produce and understand, and therefore there's something else going on. That's the idea. Okay, so that's my story so far about dependency grammar. I want to tell you a little bit about movement. Do we need movement? I think no. So here, I'll just give you Chomsky's argument. Okay, why movement is innate is his argument. Okay, so he observed he's very clever. Okay, it was a very clever idea. So 57 proposed the movement theory, both phrase structure and movement theory of grammar in 57, and then he elaborated it in 65, and then he elaborated it some more. But in 71 was where he noted that it led to a learning problem, which is that there's a relationship here between the declarative and the interrogative. The dog will chase the cat. Will the dog chase the cat? He was fascinated by auxiliaries. Okay, English auxiliaries just like blew his mind. Okay, so he was like, and so that's what he talked about a lot back, and he did a lot of times. And so he assumes those are the same ises and the same wills in those cases, and it's obviously movement for him. It has to be that this is the same one, and it's moving to the front in these cases. If that's the case, if it's movement, there are two possible rules that he noticed, and those are either the structure dependent rule, which he thinks is the right rule. You look for the main verb in the whole sentence and you move the appropriate form to the front, or the rule, which is kind of obvious another way, is linear position. You just look at the first occurrence of the verb and move that to the front. And that's wrong. And you can show that that one's wrong, because all you got to, which what he did in this 71 paper was say, look, like you can look at these more complicated sentences, like the dog which is in the corner is hungry, and you see, well, how do you make a question out of that? Do people say, is the dog which is in the corner hungry? The structure dependent rule? Yes, that's what people do. Or do they do this other one, which is linear position? Take this one first. Is the dog which in the corner is hungry? And no one says that. That's like crazy and impossible. And even if you do ask a kid to do this experiment, they don't do that either. And so people said, oh, that means, so he says, we never encounter these sentences. The dog which is in the corner is hungry. And he said never. It is quite possible for a person to go through life without ever having heard the relevant examples to choose between. Whether it's ever or rare, it's hard to learn, is his point. So then he argued that it has to be innate. Okay. The problem with the argument is that it relies on the fact that on the idea that movement is part of the grammar. What if movement isn't part of the grammar, right? So the alternative is an alternative, which Bresnan and other people have noticed, have like argued for, is that there's just two ises, or there's two wills. Okay, so there's instead of moving will to the front, you have a lexical rule which says, oh, I take the declarative one and I make an interrogative one out of will. So every time I have an auxiliary verb, I make another auxiliary verb which looks like it but has a slightly different argument structure, which has, you it has the subject comes after as opposed to before. Okay, and so that's not movement. It's a different way to generate the same kinds of phenomena, and that's learnable. So that's sort of construction based. People call that construction based, and maybe that's what large language models are learning. Like he never talks about that alternative. Chomsky never talks about that alternative. I presume he just thought it was inefficient or repetitive or something. Like basically the idea that there might be two is's or two wills or two, like he thinks that maybe is ugly or something, but he doesn't say why it's bad. I mean, I don't know why he thinks it's bad. There's like 30 entries for make. I mean, he knows, like people know this. Like for like English, every language has many representations for related for very frequent words. Like they have different meanings. They're used in different contexts. They're usage like so. If you look up make in English, or take or something, these things have like 30 entries in the dictionaries, which we all know and that's true for. So what's the problem with having two is's or two wills? I don't know what, I don't know exactly what the problem is. And another advantage of this idea is that there's a bunch of forms of auxiliaries which are only good in declarative or interrogative, which is like, that ends up being very easy to explain in a lexical ruling, just like the rule doesn't apply by usage to these cases. It doesn't, and that's difficult for the movement thing to block. How does the movement thing block these? So in English, I can say, "Aren't I invited to the party?" That's actually how I say it. But that's only interrogative. I can't say I aren't invited. I would say I'm not invited to the party, but not I aren't invited. It's not okay. And I bet better is an auxiliary, which is declarative. I better go to the party, but not better I go to the party. And ought is like that. I ought to go to the party. Ought I go to the party? I mean, some speakers of British English or accept that. American English and Canadian English reject that. It's not. So it seems very clearly actually usage based. So it's like depending on where you are, that's okay or not. It's not good for me. I cannot say ought I go. Ought is only declarative for me. And I recognize that old British people say that, but I still, it's like have in the inversion as well. I can't use have as an interrogative. I can only use that in the declarative. It's very similar. And there's some more cases like this. So this is a problem for the movement rule. These are problems. It has to be much more, it's simple in the lexical copying rule. It's very simple. So I mean, this is like reasons why I like no movement, don't like movement. And I like simplicity. I like I think that's plausibly what's going on in the large language models. That's partly motivated by this. There's other reasons, other evidence people have given to think, well, phrase structure and movement are on the right track. One of them is island phenomena. So I'm going to say a little more here. I'm not going to say much about this though. And the argument was going back to Chomsky, pile of papers here, going back to 73, 77. He was prolific on really arguing very interesting things. That independent of the meaning of the type of construction, some long distance dependencies are just impossible. And it turns out he just didn't do the experiment. If you look at the construction, it matters hugely. Just look at there's all these different constructions which allow long distance dependency. If you do that experiment, there's massive variability in what's possible and what's not possible. So it does seem construction, it does seem usage-based, discourse-based. It's not syntax. If it were syntax, just purely about number of nodes in between, then they should all be the same. They don't behave the same. Another argument people have used for like phrase structure grammar in particular is constituency. That's sort of a standard in the beginnings of most intro phrase structure, most syntax textbooks. But phrase structure is not a good argument for constituency, because constituency is actually semantic. I'm not going to go through that. It's not phrase structure. And you can do semantic constituency, whatever those arguments. That's just like head plus dependence in a dependency grammar. Anyway, that's all I got to say about that. That's sort of like kind of the stuff that's going on in this summary of this book that I'm giving you. Now, I just want to tell you a little bit more, just sort of putting a little more context. I don't know how much time I got. I've been talking a long time, but kind of going slowly. I'll tell you one more thing. Is that all right? Is that like, it's about 5-10 minutes, which is this. What is language for? I mean, it's putting this in context. I don't think I'm going to do this last section here. Okay. But I will tell you this. Okay. What is language for? I think it's just kind of interesting. So I'm telling you about syntax, where I think what I think a plausible, simple format for syntactic structures is. but what is language for in our brains? Okay, so first of all, and there's two ideas that have been long out there, and one of them is communication, the other one's thought. And so going back to Chomsky thinks that language equals thought in some way or other, which is kind of fascinating idea. But an alternative is it's not, and it is just communication. Okay, how do we figure this out? And I think F. Fedorenko's group basically has figured this out, and the answer is it's communication. It's not thought. And so how do you do that? You couldn't do it just by thinking about it. You got to do experiments. You got to like get into the brain here, okay, to figure this out. And what she's done is, well, first of all, you've done a whole lot of stuff figuring out that each one of us has a language network. And I said it's a left lateralized series of left lateralized regions. It tends to be left lateralized on the frontal, temporal, and parietal cortex, which supports language processing above perception, above visual perception, auditory perception. So you can find the language network I told you roughly before, but here's like you listen to language versus a perceptually matched control, sentences versus non-word speech versus muffled speech, and you get this network. And my network's a little different from yours. It'll be quite different actually, but it's remarkably, it's the same for me every time. So this is me scanning, what is it, like 17 years ago now, me scanning 15 years ago or whatever that is, like 12 years ago, and me a couple of years ago, and you get the same, and I'm very left lateralized. There's nothing on the right for me, almost nothing on the right, and we get pretty much the same network. Those things should look kind of similar. They're very, very similar in the broad scheme. I don't think I should show you what other people's brains look like. They look kind of different from mine. So what we do is what Fedorenko's group has done is like, to answer this question, does this language network rely on specialized mechanisms for just for language, or is it shared machinery with other cognitive processes? And the claim in the literature from Chomsky, well, his idea, but it's not, other people have argued that it overlaps, is what they do is they look at, they see activation for some tasks, say math, arithmetic, or music, or action observation, if you're thinking about, or some social cognition, and you see activation in some area of the brain on the left, which looks like it might be in the language network. Okay, you just see activation. Oh, there's left frontal. People always broke this left frontal thing. People often just call Broca's area. The idea of Broca's area is a really very weirdly used term. Whatever Broca, there's left frontal stuff. And it turns out there's multiple networks running through that left frontal stuff, and it's not those networks aren't doing the same things at all. Okay, so what you have to do to test this claim is examine the overlap directly within individual brains. So we have to find my language network and see how it activates relative to some other task, okay, relative to arithmetic task. And so that's what she's done for many, many, many tasks. And so here's language activations for sentences versus non-words. So first of all, you find the language network in me or you or anyone. Okay, you find that. And then you do new task. Okay, we do language again. So we're going to select these voxels. These are the language network which we selected. And we're going to do some new language now. And sure enough, that's very replicable. We find lots of activation in the same network that we found in completely independent materials. We always find that. It's very, very robust. And you find that in my network, like I say, even over 18 years or 17 years, you find this over and over and over, the same thing. Then we can do some other tasks. In this, the left frontal part or left parietal, we can look in those sections and see of that network. Are those things are they responding to an arithmetic task, a hard versus easy arithmetic task, an action gesture response task, some social cognitive task, some executive function task? She's actually looked at lots of other kinds of tasks. And the answer is no. The answer is just universally no to anything that's not language, that isn't language. That just language does language and only language and nothing else. And so that partly answers this question that, what is the language network for? Is it for thinking? No, it's not for thinking. Anything you think is thinking, that's this stuff. Everything else is thinking of something. All these other kinds of hard tasks, those are thinking, higher level cognition, and language is not doing those tasks. Language just isn't doing those tasks. Another way to investigate this question in people who've had what's called global aphasia, basically have a massive stroke to the left side of their brain, but they've left the right side pretty much intact. And those are pretty rare patients, actually. There's not very many of those. like if you have such a large stroke on the left, you usually use a lot on the right, and then then there's just nothing to evaluate. But this woman at University College London, Rosemary Varley, has been investigating global aphasics. These are three of her patients from a 95 paper, or no, from 2005 paper. And so they have massive strokes to the left side, and these people can't do language. This is the measure now is like, can they do some language tasks? And the measure in the answer is no, they can't do any language tasks, but they can do arithmetic, causal reasoning, music, spatial navigation, social cognition, just as well as age match controls, just as well. Like they can do it. Like these are like kind of normal individuals who just can't talk. They can't talk and they can't understand. You can still communicate with them. So they just don't have our communication system. They've lost English as a communication system. That doesn't mean you can't communicate. I can still communicate with people who I don't share a language system with. So as Dilara mentioned, I've done some work with some remote groups in Amazon, and I don't speak Piroha and I don't speak Chimani. Those are the two groups I've worked with, but I can still communicate with those people because we have shared goals. And I can sort of point to things and they can understand, oh, you're hungry. We can do things like, I can do that. And so we can, and these people, Rosemary Varley's patients, have a huge shared context. They're adult, they're older people from England who have a huge context of knowing what tasks are, for example. So they kind of know what they're kinds of things they're supposed to do, and yet they can't do the language test, but they can do arithmetic. You might think arithmetic is like language, and it's just not. These are symbols. It's very symbolic. They can do math. It's kind of amazing, but it's not language-based. That's kind of pretty cool. So we'd argue that the language represented in the brain is specialized for language only. I think language is for communication. It's not for complex thought, and there's just no overlap. That's Ev's argument. I think that's plausibly right. So then we have to understand what communication is. And that's a whole other research program, which I've been working on for a bunch of years now, which is noisy channel models of language production and comprehension is about communication. So it's like the thing interesting about communication is that there's noise. There's a representation of language. That's maybe the syntactic representation I've been arguing about here, but getting it to you is it's a stochastic process such that I'm going to do something, I'm going to try to say something which will give a meaning to you that I'm trying to convey to you. But there's a lot of probability in this. I might not get the right representations. You might not hear exactly what I may not say what I intended to say. You might have noise. So that's like kind of noise in how I'm producing whatever I'm trying to produce. There's a lot of potentially errors, right? There's errors in that. And on your side, there's a lot of things where you may have some biases of various kinds. We may, in this case here, me speaking to you guys who are all second language or many second language, English speakers, there's like noise in that, right? The way I speak English, the way you understand English isn't quite the same. And so we're always moving towards biases, priors of what we probably think the other meant. And so we need models of that. That's, I think sort of Bayesian modeling is what we're doing there. And I'm going to stop there. I've got a bunch of stuff to say about that, but I don't want to say more. So what I argue here is like a summary of this thing. I told you I wouldn't talk. It was an hour already. So I like about dependency grammar, as I said, is it's very simple, minimal structure, no movement. I like that. I just like simplicity, and it sort of maps onto these large language model structures. But it transparently explains cognitive complexity phenomena and explains why word orders exist and others don't in a simple way. And so that's why I've written this book the way I wrote it. And I just want to thank all these people. And I am available here to talk to you for, I don't know, at least a while, an hour, 45 minutes or something. If you guys have questions or comments or anything, I'm happy to talk to you. Oh, so I can run this, right?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so yeah, Asli, you
Hello.
Hi, you please go ahead. And if someone,
Well,
can I just mention, if people want to type stuff in the chat, I can read the chat. No one did that along the way. I didn't see anyone do that unless I missed something. I don't think I did. Yeah, please go ahead.
I actually have two questions, but I guess I should ask one and then
perhaps wait for another turn to ask the other one, I guess. Well, I'll just ask one of them now.
Sure.
I wanted to ask this because it hasn't been explicitly mentioned in the presentation. So, but perhaps it is actually part of the book. Could we say that the dependency grammar has important implications for the minimal attachment principle and the late closure principle? I mean, does it have implications for those, or are they already in the theoretical background of dependency grammar?
So minimal attachment and late closure are those are things from Lynn Fraser from 78, 79, and Fraser and Fodor. And so here's what I think about those. So no, they're definitely not in here. Like late closure is essentially recency. Okay, so that is just locality. It's a weird statement of locality. Late closure is so, but it's very similar. So late closure is, I mean, it's just a weird name for locality, and so that's very similar. So in some ways, so that is just recency, I'll say, pretty much. But minimal attachment is different. So minimal attachment says that I prefer fewer syntactic nodes over more syntactic nodes. And there's nothing in this theory or anything that says anything about, I just don't think that's right. So I don't think that, like, that's a phrase structure oriented theory. I think the right generalization for whatever was leading to minimal attachment effects is basically surprisal. I didn't talk about surprisal today, but syntactic surprisal, they're like that's what these large language models are working on is like how so surprisal is very good. I didn't talk about this at all. That is in the book, surprisal stuff. I mean, that's just like, it's well known that people are sensitive to the distributions of language that they're exposed to. And so that's what surprisal is saying, is like you are very, very good at expecting what the next word is in some sequence. And if you get some very surprising word, you will read it slower. You'll have more difficulty with that. That's surprisal. Minimal attachment is basically was doing that, but surprisal does it much better. It's got surprisal has more parameters. Minimal attachment is kind of simpler in some ways, but it also relies on a weird phrase structure, a bunch of weird phrase structures. I would argue so I would say surprisal is the current version. I would say the probably more correct version of what minimal attachment was trying to do. And I haven't said much about surprisal is, I'd say, correct. So people, meaning like there is like great evidence that people are exquisitely sensitive to expectations in language as they're coming in, and it's so like Roger Levy. So the guy, John Hale's paper in 2001 proposed a way to think about surprisal. Roger Levy sort of figured it out in a little more detail in 2008. And then in a paper in 2013, Nathaniel Smith and Roger Levy showed in English that in corpus of people reading texts, you get surprisal effects across like 6 orders of magnitudes of distributions of words. So like it's very, very exquisitely good at predicting reading times. And the way I was talking about dependency length, it made it sound like it does really well at that. It does not do very well at that. If you choose random texts, surprisal is what does really well at predicting the next word reading times, really, really well. And the only place where surprisal doesn't do well is when you get very long distance dependency. Like the cases where I was talking about where things are complicated, surprisal predicts those things to be fast, and they're not, they're slow. And so there's definitely space here for dependency length, but surprisal is a very, very strong predictor. And I think anyone who does anything nowadays always includes in big language models always has a surprisal measure of something, because and so the problem with minimal attachment is it's kind of theory loaded. Surprisal's not. And you can measure that off from the texts themselves. And so anyway, it's sort of in there. Does that answer your question? That's good, I hope. Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think Matthew's next.
Hi, yeah. Thank you. Thank you for Hachitepa for putting everything on, for organizing this, and thank you for your very interesting talk. You're primarily a a laboratory scientist, you do empirical work, but you shared today this sort of underrepresented syntactic tradition. That you're working in it. It's very interesting. You've differentiated yourself from the Chomskyan tradition, the phrase structure grammar. And I have sort of a theoretical question about that. The conclusion that that tradition's reached over 30, 40 years is that words are organized with the same syntax that phrases are. So there's no difference between words and phrases. And so much of your being able to count dependency lengths has to do with words. So I wonder how concretely, say, in English, you could do lexical decomposition on kill. Kill means to cause to become dead. That would add 2 more dependencies if you chose that paraphrase, right? But in English, you don't have to do that for that concept. It's all tied up into one single word, kill. For the Turkish-speaking audience, I think the Turkish word with the record holder for the longest word translates to, are you one of those we were unable to Europeanize? And it's one word in Turkish, almost one word. I think the question particle at the end would maybe make it 2 words, but you're able to, in this agglutinating language, with the morphology, you're able to express these ideas with, I guess it would be 0 dependency there. I mean, there's no dependency in a single word. So I wonder, like, in your work with Richard Futrell, your comparative work, how do you deal with, the boundary between, what's a word or what's a maybe a morpheme, a more meaningful bit of language that that you would be able to count as far as dependencies go? So in English, we need prepositions to mark case, where in a lot of inflectional languages, they just make a different word.
I mean, it just depends on the phenomena. So what are, it just depends on the phenomena. Oh, sorry. Oh, good. Thanks. I heard myself twice. So what, I don't know what the, I haven't talked about what a word is versus a morpheme here. I don't know. I'm just relying on some intuitions here versus like, so clearly, I think everyone understands what a morpheme is. Defining what a word is pretty hard, actually, right? And so, I would just, depend on what the phenomena are that you want to explain. I mean, I agree with you that you could look within words in morphemes to see if there are dependency length phenomena there. I mean, I don't know if there are or they're not. If to the extent that there are, that would be interesting to look at. I don't know what the complexity measures are for such things, if there are any, So I don't know what the observation is here. What's an observation that I should know that you think I should know that would be helpful to, like, I don't like you said that there's like a, like, I don't like you said that there's like, sorry, we got like a delay here. Oh, sorry, we got like a delay here.
Mm. Yeah, we do have a bit of a delay. Could you hear my feedback? No, in your work with Richard Futrell, which was comparative.
Yeah.
Right. And so Turkish was one of those graphs that you showed. How did you control for, that in English, the future is going to use some auxiliary. So we're going to have another word that's going to introduce one more dependency length for anything that crosses over it, right? Whereas in some other languages, it's not going to be countable if it's just an inflection on the end of the verb. So I wonder, in that sort of comparative sense, since you're counting words and the number of dependencies between words, how can you control for that when you look at different types of languages?
That's a confound. I mean, so there's a confound there in the universal dependency corpora, which I kind of implicitly referred to, or maybe almost, I think, explicitly said that we just used whatever universal dependencies corpora did, and different groups do different things with what counts as a word versus what counts as a morpheme in those things. Like, just because someone chose, and so that's a kind of a problem, right? So, but for the rough strokes that we were looking at, like, I was saying that maybe the differences in strength of the dependency length minimization, they might be due to differences in ways that people coded what counts as a morpheme versus what counts as a word effectively there. So that is, like, in the case marking, some of those languages were counting case markers as separate words, and some were counting them as part of the noun. And so you basically either had a dependency between like the case marker and the noun, or you didn't have it at all because it was just a word. And so that just went to the verb. That just is gone. And so, and then what your point, I guess, is that, you know, if I have a dependency between the case marker and the noun, then things that go across that will go across two things as opposed to across one thing. You'll get longer dependencies when you separate those things. And so, I mean, I consider that a confound in the way that these people, it is a confound in the way these people have coded these things. But, you know, that's a lot of work to go and recode them all correctly. And so, but presumably, I mean, I don't know, you know, in spite of that, we still see dependency length mattering for all these cases. Now, I don't know what the right way to do it is. Like, so maybe what you're asking is, if you do it as morphemes, you might get better results, maybe, or maybe you'll get, I don't know, maybe you get worse results. I don't know what the answer is to that. I haven't, like, because in English it's not as morphemes, right? So in English it's as words, right? And so it kind of depends on what counts as a word is sort of different across these languages. That's the problem in a way. That's the confound. And so you know, so there's work to be done there. I guess there would be work to be done there to deconfound that across a few of these languages, where, you know, fix some of those things so that they're same and see what happens and make some inferences about why that might be. But for now, all I'm trying to say something very blunt, which is that languages are tending to minimize dependency lengths to some degree. You know, so I don't, you know, I'm open to being wrong. And so maybe it'll be if you do the, I don't know, you know, you know, it's kind of remarkable that it's that strong across all these languages, no matter what the coding was that these different people suggest. You know, Universal's dependency corpora, they're not doing, you know, the way they code, I should say that I don't like their grammar I don't think it's the right grammar for language in general. So they have they code things a little strangely. So the subordinator, the complementizer is never the head for them. The preposition is never the head, even in spite of, so the preposition is not a head for them. The preposition is always a dependent for them. The nouns are the heads. It's always between content words. This is like a decision they made, not based on normal headedness tests that linguists tend to use. So many linguists don't really like what they did in some ways, but it makes it easier for random people to code these things in a consistent way. And so that they have different goals, right? There are computational linguists who are trying to use this for some other reason, not for figuring out what human languages are. So, I mean, I guess the answer is I don't know how this will, if we deconfound that, and we'll find out, I guess, if we do it. Thank you very much for the question.
Yes. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much for the question. So how do I go here? I've got, is it top down or bottom up on this? I got 2 thumbs up here. On some let me see if I'll read the things. I'm going to go from the oldest first, if that's okay. So I've got Zainab asked this question. You mentioned, I'm just reading from the chat, okay? You mentioned the language being for communication. You also said that we could communicate without language. I couldn't understand this part of my mistake. The communication system, language is like English and Turkish are conventionalized communication systems. So the language network in the brain is measuring the conventionalized communication system, which is English or Turkish or something like that. Some conventionalized system. So you're right, though I'm using the word communicate in 2 different ways is basically what that means. So I can communicate in, like, if I'm using English, like, so English or Turkish or Japanese or something, that's the language network. If I'm doing something like pointing to things, then I'm not using the language network. Okay, that's all I meant. Okay, number 2 here is from Khan Okan says, the question is, what is language for? Not to communicate, it's obviously called dogma, not to picture reality. Inside about that. It's not for thinking like you and Antar. What? I'm trying to understand this. The question is, what is language for? Okay, not to communicate, not to picture. If it is not for thinking, like you said, then phone or language without thought must be wrong. So what is it for? It is for communication, is what I'm arguing. So I'm arguing the language network, English, Chinese, Turkish, all these things are communication systems, conventionalized communication systems is what they are. They're not thinking systems. So there's some independent thinking language of thought. Phoner is something else. That's all these other, all conceptual, there's other networks doing other things, not language. Language is translating those conceptual things. That's the hypothesis based on the observations. There's two kinds of observations. One is like choose your task. A recent task is like programming. You might think programming uses language. It doesn't use language, turns out. No English, no whatever language, it doesn't use it at all. There's no overlap in, these are for expert programmers, what network are they using when they're programming? It's not language network, it's some other multiple demands network. They're using that. Social cognition is a different network, not language. So the claim here is that the conventionalized communication system that we have in English and Turkish and French and German and Chinese is not for thinking. There's a separate, I think partly there's an interesting question that comes up here where many people have I didn't bring this up, but I'll bring it up now, which is many people have they have a sense in which they're thinking in language. They have an inner voice. I think about 70 or 80% of people have this sense that when they're thinking to themselves, they hear themselves talking to themselves. And so if I did like a questionnaire here, I bet you about 70 or 80, like 2/3 or 4/5 of you would say yes, that when you're thinking, you have this sense that you hear yourself talking to yourself. Okay, and so I think that may confound things. That there's this sense that you hear yourself talking to yourself a lot of times, which makes people think that that's what thinking is that inner voice. I should point out that there's a bunch of people, 20% or a quarter or something, that just don't feel like this. I'm one of those. And so I'm one of those people that does not have an inner voice, and I don't really understand. I always find this so confusing when people talk about the inner voice. I thought this was some metaphor. I had no idea what they're talking about. And so anyway, so maybe that's why I have no trouble with the idea that language is for communication as opposed to thinking, because I don't feel like I have an inner voice. But that's an interesting open question. Like that, this is kind of like thinking about talking to yourself. We need experimental work, some ways to investigate inner voice. And there's a guy called Gary Lupian at the University of Wisconsin who's investigating inner voice stuff, and other people trying to figure out what the relationship is between inner voice and language. And so I think we think. Ev, Fedorenko, me, and Steve, we have a paper coming out where we argue that language is just for the conventionalized language system that we learn in English and Turkish or whatever. These are languages for communication, not for thinking. That's the hypothesis. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next one if that's okay. I don't know how else to do this. So I'm going to Gajde Mersan, and she asks, "Thank you for this great talk." You're welcome. I have recently been thinking about a research question that is, I think, relevant to this. So Turkish is mostly like that. Yep. Many cannot class SOV. Yep. From all. Yep. Word order is really free and taken together with intonation. Yep. So it would normally be embedded. Man, nom, woman, gen. We saw. The man saw that the woman left was leaving is arguably more frequent than the alternative. Man, nom, saw, woman, gen, leaving. The latter seems advantageous for crossing. If the form is the canonical form. I find this interesting with that and worth testing. Yeah. So the prediction, I don't know. I know a little bit about Turkish. I looked at Turkish a little bit once. I visited there years and years ago, but I don't really know Turkish very well. I sort of, you guys can tell me. I know Turkish is a so-called verb final language. It's mostly verb final. It's case marked, but I'm not sure how it does with these embedded clauses. Is it a language that has? So does it have? First of all, does it have an embedded clause marker like a that, or and it probably does. And where does that occur relative to the verb? Does it come before or after? Like I was saying, in Japanese and Korean, a lot of these languages it comes after, but there I try to point it out there in that harmonic thing that there is a substantial minority of languages which violate that generalization, where there seems to be a strong tendency for some languages to really want to put that marker first before even for verb final languages, they put it first. And so the dependency length minimization will predict that some of those orders are, the shorter ones. I can't do this in my head. I'm sorry, whatever you got here, your particular cases in that question in the chat. but it'll make a prediction. It's very clear what the prediction is that more local, like sum up the dependency lengths, and the more local one will be the one that should be preferred. Does that mean it is preferred? Not necessarily. A, that theory could be wrong. B, there's other stuff that's going on, presumably. So we mentioned surprisal. There are usage, like, so what do I think language is? So I didn't say this at the beginning, but I probably should have said that. I think language is an invented system, right? So I have a very different take than Chomsky, clearly, on all this stuff. And so I don't think it's innate at all. I think it's an invented system where we're trying to communicate with each other. I didn't talk about words. I have a whole bunch of work on words where it's very clearly invented, where words are invented. That different cultures have different kinds of words for different things they want to talk about. And so there's these languages like Pianoha, which have no words for counting at all, right? They don't have a word for one and no word for two. It's kind of astounding for us, our culture, where of course counting is so important. They have no words for those. Why is that? It's because it's just not useful in their culture. They just don't count. It's not like they couldn't understand it and they couldn't learn it. They just don't use it. It's not useful. So I think that generalizes. So that kind of observation generalizes that languages invent labels for things they want to talk about. They invent ways to put things together for the ways they want to communicate. That's what I think I think it's a very simple thing to say. So it's a cultural invention. And then dependency length is kind of a cognitive constraint on those kinds of inventions. But that's kind of where I'm working from. I'm thinking in that direction. Is it true? I don't know. It's a simple way to think. It's very different from the way Chomsky thinks. It's very, very different. He and I don't agree a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and if I may follow up on that, I'm the person who asked the question. Sorry, I can't open my video. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, but I was also thinking that would be the prediction of dependency grammar, because we have a center embedding on the one hand, like ABBA versus ABAB, but it seems like, even though it seems to be the intuitively more easy one to process, really, in actual language use, we use the center embedded version more frequently. So this actually brings me to the question of whether cognitive economy is always reflected in actual frequencies that we see in language. Or, and also about the complementizer marker, we don't have a separate word. Of course, we have a morpheme that nominalizes the verb. So it's like literally we say, man saw the woman's coming. All sorts of that clauses would work like that in Turkish. Yeah.
So the first point, well, the general question, the answer is no. Mm-hmm. Does any, like, no theory is perfect. Language, if no matter what it is, whether it's invented as a cultural system or whether it's something else, it's incredibly complicated, right? So there are 50,000 words and tens of thousands of ways of combining them in English, and I'm sure the same in Turkish. It's a very, very complicated, conventionalized system. And so to say that the fact that it's not surprising that there's tons of exceptions to general tendencies. So words, more frequent words tend to be shorter than, that's like sure. a zip rule, right? It's a frequent word is shorter, but there's tons of exceptions. Okay, sure. There's a correlation. It's not perfect because there's many factors which are causing these predictions. So it's just not the way I'm trying to test a claim about dependency length is to look across, a lot of structures within a language and across many languages. It's kind of remarkable that within any language, you get, when you do a reasonable control, you get a bias towards dependencies close. Now, for a particular structure, there's going to be a lot of stuff going on, and I don't, other than dependency length, and I don't know what those factors are. So what you were talking there about ABBA versus ABAB, so that's like a common. So that's kind of, there's another, ABAB is shorter, right? Or, is more local dependencies than ABBA. But AB also has cross dependencies, right?
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
and cross dependencies are, dependency,
Also.
there's some constraint against cross dependencies, and that's projectivity in language. And so people don't like cross dependencies. Maybe that's got to do with learning. Maybe that's got to do with the baseline thing. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. So yes, so yes, it's true. Dependency link doesn't explain that. But there's some other factor which is very plausibly actually part of, not just that's phrase structure grammar or dependency grammar, cross dependencies, whichever. I didn't try and say that phrase structure is wrong, because I think I didn't go into, I actually really like combinatorial categorical grammar, in case people that's phrase structure grammar. And the reason I like that grammar, that's a really cool grammar, because it has a semantics which works with this compositional semantics, which works really well, which dependency grammar does not. And so there's like advantages to some of these systems. I mean, the downside, the trade-off for combinatorial categorical grammar is it's kind of hard to generalize to less understood languages, where dependency grammar is really easy to, I can do that in Native American languages very easily.
We actually had a professor at Middle East Technical University in Ankara, Cem Bozcahi, who collaborated with Steedman on creating that CCG grammar for Turkish, and it seems to work pretty well for Turkish, as far as I see.
I really think that there's a lot of advantages to CCG. So I don't want to say that phrase structure and that's my favorite grammar. Favorite phrase structure grammar is combinatorial categorical grammar. It does things like conjunction, coordination really, really well, like really better, which are really hard to do in, actually you can do in dependency grammar, okay.
Dependencies,
dependency grammar is okay too, but not in, but it's hard, the semantics is tough. And that's where it's very good in his grammar. So,
thank you so much. And I don't want to take others' time as well. If you don't mind me emailing you sometime, maybe about this, I would appreciate it. Thank you so much, Professor.
You're welcome. No problem. Okay, I'm going to go to the next, which is that okay? Royo Ma, thank you for the insightful findings. It seems to me the term locality defined is more about linear rather than absolutely. Is this correct? That is exactly right. So it says here, the locality and dependency locality is about linear rather than structural distance. That's exactly right. Between syntactic, it is linear distance that matters, right? How similar is locality? Whenever I say locality and recency, I'm always talking linear. That's what I mean. That is exactly what I mean. So when people talk about structural distance, they're mostly talking about phrase structure when they do that. And I'm not doing phrase structure. I'm doing dependency grammar here because I like reading those things off. I like the linearity of that. So that's a clarification, I hope. I don't know what there are other people. I'll just leave it at that. If you got a follow up, I'm happy to do that. Okay, so honestly, I'm leaving a second question here. Yes, as far as I'm concerned, dependency grammars, at least essence of them have their right. That's correct. That's right. It goes further back than that. It goes further back. It goes back to dependency grammar goes back. So historian of linguistics. Yeah, someone was asking about historian of linguistics. Okay, let me see. I'm gonna stop sharing for 1 sec. If I can figure out how to do that. There, I figured out how to do that. And so Dick Hudson, he's someone he's a guy who does word grammar, and he's helped me with, he's told me about some of the history of where dependency grammars come from. And let me, just in case you're interested, I'm not inventing any of this stuff. There it is. Find it. It's ancient. So it goes back to, hold on. I can't remember who argues it, but maybe I wrote it up here. Yeah. So Robbins 67 has a book about history of linguistics, and says that it goes back to Panini, which is around it. When did Panini live? It's somewhere, they don't even know. So it's somewhere between 600 and 300 BC. So that's where dependency grammar started, actually. It goes way back to that. It's way, way pre-Middle Ages. The first versions of these things is ancient times. Okay. And so I got that from Dick Hudson. I'm just laughing at Matthew's. Right, your voice will shut up. Okay. Okay. I don't have an inner voice, so I'm okay. Oh, yes. So Zema asked it to a functional view of language. Yes, exactly right. That's dead on. So that is my functional view of languages. It's about communication. Yes. I mean, yeah, it's about a conventionalized communication system. That's a view. That's my view. But it could be wrong. All right. So are there other questions? I'm finished with the chat. People want to talk, speak up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Please. You're muted. You're still muted.
Hocam sesinizi açmanız gerek sanırım, duyamıyoruz size.
Sorry. Okay, welcome, Professor Gibson. That's very nice to have you. I'm one of the lecturers in the department. And I just wanted to add a point that Aslı has made about the history of linguistics and stuff. Actually, I just give lectures on history of linguistics. I myself... I would like to, actually my internet connection, it says is not super duper, but may I just share one thing? I just want to ask you a question related with that. Is it possible?
Absolutely, but I missed most of what you said because of your internet connection.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, my internet connection, it says is not stable, but is it fine now? Can you follow me?
Yeah, it's okay now. I can hear you now.
Okay, so can I share the screen with you? One thing related with Robins's book.
Oh, sure. I mean, if someone else allows you.
Okay. I think here, one moment. Oh, that's not it. Sorry. Okay, here. 1 second. Sorry for taking the time. Here, okay. So that I found one section from Robinson's book, and in this kind of grammar, in the medieval ages, like there's a different understanding of phrase structure, I think, because they have maybe a more ontological understanding of what could be the dependent and what could be the determinant category. For example, here, in the Socrates albus phrase, adjective is regarded as the dependent category and terminant is the noun. Terminant feels like the head actually at that time. Do you think there's some kind of relevance of this understanding of dependency grammar from the Middle Ages and yours?
I mean, there's an old question is what the heads of nouns are, noun phrases are. So that's like an and there's just a some people think it's a determiner or an article, and some people think it's the noun, and there's just a long discussion of that. So actually Dick Hudson, the guy who I'm following very closely, he's word grammar, he thinks determiner is correct, and I have not followed that assumption. But that's the details of which is the head is typically doesn't matter much for these dependency length effects that I'm talking about. So it does matter for verbs versus their dependence. So there has to be, like, a verb has to be ahead of a verb phrase, of a clause or something. But otherwise, so that the dependency length minimization doesn't really matter it doesn't matter much what the head of a noun phrase is. I mean, it does matter. Like, that's an interesting question. But the dependency lengths don't change much depending on what you're counting. If you're counting words, they change a little bit. If you're counting the noun heads themselves, which seems to be a better way to count distances in terms of cognitive distance, then it ends up not mattering too much which one of those is the head. So for cognitive, but I agree, it's an interesting question. It's an old question which I am not going to resolve. And so I just made a decision. I had to choose one. I choose now, and it seems like simple. But other people can choose article or determiner if they want, and that's fine too. And so it
Yeah,
doesn't.
okay. That's interesting to hear, because I thought that is really something that has to be important. But in the very beginning of your talk, you already mentioned that there's some kind of controversy over what could be the head or what could be the dependent category there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, even like, so for I mentioned that the universal dependencies corpora, their decisions are a little strange, I think, sometimes. So they say that they made a universal choice that only content words are heads. And so no function words can be heads for them. So determiners can't be heads. Prepositions can't be heads. Complement subordinators can't be heads for them. That's what they did. And even there, we're using their system. You get dependency length minimization effects, because what really matters is the content words in between is what really probably matters. So it's not like those decisions don't matter. Those decisions do matter when I want to look at things like word order, because I need to get the word order. I need to know which is the head of the, is it the complementizer or is it the verb? And it's the complementizer in between there. That's the head of the phrase that's following. It's not the dependent of the verb that's following. So you don't have, when you have a verb, it says, I said, that Mary is sleeping, said doesn't depend on is, and is then goes to that. It's Mary to say, it's says to that to is. Okay, that's, and there's a lot of reasons to think that, but they don't do that. But even so, it's not going to matter much for their overall, they still find overall dependency length minimization, but they won't find, they've got the wrong, we have to like do some stuff on their materials to turn their, to make their materials more, to fit what linguists think are the right tests for what's ahead in those cases. But for determiners versus nouns, like that's just a big open question, which I don't really know the answer to. There's other things, like headedness is a hard question. I get your question. Your implicit question is, it seems like it's very important. It should be important in this case as to what's the head. And in general, it is somewhat important, but it turns out that most of these things are between content words, and as long as the content words is right, then you get those things in the right order, then you're in pretty good shape for these cross-linguistic effects.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And thank you again for the very nice inspirational chat. Thanks.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Is there anybody else who would like to ask a question? You can write in the chat or just connect and open your video. I guess we have someone.
Hear me? No?
There's one, and someone added something. Did I miss something?
Yes.
Matthew. Okay, an early slide, you showed the human annotated DAG, in black together with the BERT one. There was a difference between, was there a difference? Huh. I thought they were identical, but maybe I'm wrong. So he likes, maybe, I don't remember what that one did. Let me see. I got that slide. This is the BERT versus human annotated. I thought they're identical, but maybe you noticed something that's different between them. You're right. So BERT connects. I didn't notice that. I thought they're identical. That is weird. It's actually inconsistent, just in case you care. Just have to notice. Yeah, so I should share my slides again. Let me do that. It's actually, I never noticed that. So you're noticing here that BERT is making the head of this newly created RTC, and then the human one is saying RTC is the head. That's correct. You're right there. That's all right. But look, notice here it's saying that in the SNL-Bela law, it's doing something inconsistent. I didn't notice that because here it's making, am I missing something? Maybe I'm wrong here. No, I'm not wrong. So it should have gone into the here if determiner was the head, and it should have gone the to, financing plan in. Am I wrong? No, that one's not right. But this one here, this one, you can't tell here because it's which is the head. But I think here we should be able to see a local one here, and we don't. So I think it's being inconsistent. I don't know what you're right. I hadn't noticed that. I never noticed that. I thought it was identical. I hadn't noticed that. I never noticed that. I thought it was identical.
Well, I think maybe RTC is a really weird noun, so it might be hard to find.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm guessing we have one more question from Kohei in the chat.
Yeah, and I'm reading it. So thank you much for the talk. I'm on the right track thinking that dependency grammar is not just a formalism of grammar, static body of knowledge distinctions, but it's also an account of real-time language processing as an account that unifies. Yeah, kind of. Yeah. So yeah, so I mean the history of this is that I worked on dependency locality stuff for ages and ages, and writing up this what is grammar, I realized that it's like kind of nice to just talk about grammar in that same way. Now your question, and so that's where I came to. I think it's just kind of easier to talk about grammar in dependency grammar terms. Now you asked about this, competence performance question. I don't have a slide on competence performance, but I don't. So I'm one of those people that doesn't think there's that's a. I don't think there is a competence performance distinction. So, let me say what I mean by that in a sec. Just hold on. I'm going to I spent a lot of time thinking. I went back and reread what Chomsky said on this. Back from 1965, and I think it doesn't make sense in a usage-based framework, which is what I think is on the right track, to think of competence being separate from performance. Okay. And so his idea, let me find his idea. I'm trying to find this thing. What does he talk about? So his idea is that there's a system in our minds that computes grammar independent of other factors, and that's competence. Okay, that's what he means. That's what Chomsky means by competence. And like, I just think that's an open question. I actually, but it's not a crazy idea. I think it's possible that grammar is computed independent of the plausibility of usage. But I'm just going to assume in usage-based, I'm sort of more of a usage-based person, that maybe it's it's all done the same together. Like that's just an assumption he's making. It's not. It could be right. It's an interesting claim. It is an interesting claim. We don't know that yet. So we're there's people trying to figure that out. I'd say that's still a hard question. I know that question gets people worked up. But I think there are really interesting questions there about, like, we can ask those are like not crazy questions. Like, that's not a crazy thing that he's saying. He's saying I don't think he has evidence for it yet, but it's a kind of a very interesting claim that you compute language independent of usage. It's like the grammar, that's possible. He doesn't have evidence for it, but it's definitely possible. So we can look in that, that's what, I think the ways to go at that question are looking at details of how the language network, I didn't talk about this much, but the language network, because I do think that's kind of a ways to go now to try and figure these things out, is figuring out how the language network does what it does. And right now, like a really interesting question is, what does the language network do? So there is a language network which is computing language in each one of us, and it's very left lateralized. And from what we know initially, it looks like that whole network is kind of doing the same thing. It probably isn't, but it looks like it is. And the reason that, the reason we don't know very well is the measure that we've got right now is MRI, fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. And what is that? That's this bold signal, which is just blood oxygenated, whatever, it's just how long it takes blood to get into your brain. And that's slow. It's 2 seconds. It takes 2 seconds for whatever you're doing, you're thinking about to get into your brain. And language is way faster than that, right? When I'm speaking here, stuff that happens over 2 seconds, a lot of stuff happens in 2 seconds. And so it's just not a great measure. So the network might be doing different parts of that network might be doing different things, and we just can't measure it directly yet. It's too indirect. It's too slow, this measure. And other measures, you might think, oh, there's other measures you could use. You could use MEG, magnetic, encephalography, or EEG. And the problem with these, which are measuring very, very fast signals, those are measuring either voltage changes or magnetic signals, which are happening millisecond by millisecond but the problem is they're on the scalp of the brain. Well, and we can't do the localization. The localization is terrible with those. People used to say MEG has got good localization. We know now it's bad. It's no better than EEG. It's better than EEG, but it's not much better. MRI is very good. You can figure out where those signals are coming from. The problem is you don't know when they came from. So it's over seconds as opposed to milliseconds. And so there's it's a problem in methodology in figuring out what we know that there's this very language specific thing happening in each one of our heads, but we don't know how it's doing it. So it's possible, I think it's very possible that different parts of that network are doing different things. Right now, it looks like they're all doing the same thing. They're all doing everything that's associated with language, associated with words, associated with syntax. So another thing that sort of Chomskyians do, the generative people, they think there's something different between morphemes and combinations of those, and and I think that when I'm coming from this functionalist point of view, where we're inventing language for things we want to talk about, then it's all the same thing. It's like, oh, it's about communication. I invent the words, I invent the combinations of the words, and so the evidence right now suggests that network is like what any voxel that's doing words is doing combinations of words as well. But it's a blunt measure, and it could very well be that composition is in something different. So anyway, this is just a big open question. Okay, where am I here? Yes, this person's on. So the question between competence and performance is a hard question, I think, and it's a good, interesting question. I'm taking the view that there's just one thing. It's just one. Okay, where is the next one? Oh, Zainab saying here. I want to say your name right. Saying something, but I think my voice was not heard. No, I missed. Oh, specialized because. Oh, I didn't hear anything about any aphasic stuff at all, anyone said. So I'm reading this thing from Zainab, says I was saying something, but I think my voice was not heard properly. So you believe, including from the experiment, you mentioned that language is specialized because some aphasic patients can do other tasks, but not language, but is not specialized in the brain, like in Broca's region or something like that. This system is a special kind of communication system. It's different from other types of communication system, like different from gestures, for example. Yes, this is right. So gestures, like, so we've looked at gesturing. She's looked at, not me, so Federico's looked at gesturing, and gesturing is not in the language network, fascinatingly. So, presumably it is for sign language, okay? So for sign language, that is language. There's very little study so far in using in neurolinguistics on sign. So I don't even think Ev has done sign yet. I don't know. But so we're talking about co-speech gesturing, for example. That is not computed in the language areas. That's pretty cool. Pretty weird, eh? So it's very I mean, anything you could think of that might, you think is like similar to language in some way, turns out, unless it's language, it isn't, which is kind of amazing. And so, yeah, that's the claim. And so the particular aphasic patients I was talking about are global aphasics. There's all kinds of different language deficit. So these are global, very specific aphasic patients who've got a huge left lateralized stroke and wiped out most of their left cortex, okay? And so most people who are classified as some kind of aphasic, like Broca's or Wernicke's, all these different kinds of aphasia. This is a much more extreme case than that, where they they really can't speak at all, and they really can't understand you at all. So it's a really bad, but that's right. Anything you're saying. Okay. Also, I think one of the main concerns you have with the Chomsky theories in general is they're not based on empirical. No. I mean, yes and no. Yes and no. I do think that's a problem. So that was a problem. I do think, Chomsky's an interesting guy, very smart person, made some ideas, but then he just didn't really test the ideas. And it turns out the ideas are kind of wrong. A lot of those ideas are wrong. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's there is, yeah. There are people who, I don't know, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what my main problem is. One of the main concerns, that's a concern. That's a concern with anyone, right? If you don't do empirical work, it's a real problem to test your things. Okay, I'm gonna go to the next. Thank you for your presentation. I want to ask whether surprisal concept that you mentioned briefly related to the production distribution. Yes, it's so Mary Ellen McDonald's claim is production distribution comprehension. That is a surprisal account. For some reason, she didn't talk about Roger Levy's and John Hale's approach, but that's the same account. That's a rough version. And theirs is a computational version of the same thing. Those are identical, I'd say. Okay, yeah, I think she would agree now. Mary Ellen. I don't know why she didn't cite them way back when she's writing that. I don't know. Roger wrote a response actually saying, why didn't you cite this? And she wrote, I don't know. I should have, I think. Anyway, but I don't know. It was like weirdnesses in the field. Okay.
Okay, I guess these are all questions, and our time is nearly up anyway. It's near 8 p.m. here, and it must be noon for you in the US.
Yeah.
So I would like to wrap it up now. If there's not any question, I guess there's not. Big thanks to you, Professor Gibson, for taking the time to be our guest today. If I might add a personal comment, I'm not really a syntax person. My brain usually cries out in agony whenever I try to learn anything related to syntax, but I found this presentation surprisingly clear. I'm almost shocked at myself, really. So thank you for that. And as the students of Society of Linguistics of Hacettepe University, we thank every one of you who gathered here to listen to Professor Gibson. We hope to see you all in our future events as well. So yeah, that's all I'd like to say. Everybody's thanking you in the chat. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. If anyone has questions, you're welcome to email me. I'm happy to answer emails. Okay.
Yeah, we can share your email if that's okay with you. That's fine.
Sure. I'm easily found on the internet. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.